The night sky above the border colony burned with streaks of light as enemy ships crossed into the sector. The alarms had been ringing for hours, and people were running in every direction. Shops were left open, homes abandoned, and the streets turned into chaos. In the middle of all this, a boy named Kieran moved quietly through the shadows, his eyes fixed on a small alien food stall that had been left behind. His stomach growled painfully, but his steps were light and careful. He was not supposed to be here, but hunger was louder than fear. The stall belonged to a family from the Ellerin species. They were known for their bright eyes, silver hair, and sharp senses. Right now, none of them were around. Kieran slipped behind the counter, his fingers trembling as he reached for a basket of fruit-like pods. They were glowing faintly in the dark, each one full of sweet, filling juice. He grabbed two, then hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears. Before he could leave, a soft voice spoke from the shadows. "That's stealing, human." Kieran froze, his breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly to see her, an Ellerin girl, maybe his age, standing with her arms crossed. Her silver hair shimmered under the flickering streetlight, and her golden eyes locked on him. She wore a simple woven tunic, but the way she stood made her look like someone important. Kieran took a step back, clutching the pods tighter. The girl stepped forward, her gaze sharp but curious. "Do you know what happens to thieves here?" she asked quietly. Kieran shook his head. He wanted to explain, to tell her about the hunger, about how his group hadn't eaten in 2 days. But before he could speak, the ground shook violently. Both of them stumbled as a blast echoed from the hills outside the colony. The enemy had begun firing. The girl's eyes widened. She glanced toward the direction of the noise, then back at him. "Come with me," she said suddenly. Kieran stared confused. "What?" She didn't answer. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him away from the stall. He nearly dropped the pods, but her grip was strong. They ran through the narrow alleys, the sound of energy fire getting closer. The air smelled of smoke and dust. Kieran's legs burned, but the girl didn't slow down until they reached a small, hidden doorway under a collapsed wall. She shoved him inside. The space was a storage room, dimly lit and full of strange alien tools. She shut the door quickly, breathing hard. "You're lucky I found you," she said, leaning against the wall. Kieran frowned. "You were about to report me." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "I still might." But her voice didn't sound angry anymore. It was almost amused. She pointed to the pods in his hands. "Eat them before they get cold. You'll need the energy if we're going to survive tonight." Kieran hesitated, then took a bite. The sweet liquid filled his mouth, and he felt strength return to his body. Outside, the explosions grew louder. The girl moved to a small crack in the wall and peeked out. "The enemy will search every building," she whispered. "If they find you, they won't care whether you stole or not. Humans aren't welcome here in the first place." Kieran swallowed hard, realizing how dangerous the situation was. "Then why are you helping me?" he asked. She didn't look at him, her eyes still on the street. "Because," she said softly, "maybe you're not the enemy they told me you are." Her voice carried something he didn't understand, but it made him feel less alone. That was the first moment Kieran began to wonder who she really was. The blast outside shook the walls again, making dust fall from the ceiling. Kieran pressed his back against the cold stone, trying to keep his breathing quiet. The girl glanced at him from the crack in the wall, her golden eyes reflecting the flicker of distant fires. "They are closer than I thought," she whispered. Kieran tightened his grip on the half-eaten pod in his hand, wondering how long they could stay hidden. Without warning, a shadow passed over crack. The girl pulled back fast, motioning for him to stay low. Heavy footsteps echoed just outside, followed by a strange metallic clicking sound. Kieran's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard about the enemy's soldiers, insect-like armor, clawed hands, and voices that rattled like dry bones. One wrong move, and they would find the door. The girl moved quietly, pulling a long metal rod from a shelf. Her stance shifted, like someone ready for a fight. Kieran almost spoke, but stopped when she held a finger to her lips. The footsteps grew fainter, moving away. The clicking faded into the distance. She slowly lowered the weapon and let out a short breath. "We have to leave this place," she said firmly. "If they search this side of the colony, this room will not save us." Kieran nodded, swallowing the last bite of the pod before following her to the door. The streets outside were darker now, the fires hidden behind rising smoke. The girl led him down a narrow passage between two broken buildings. Every few steps, she would stop and listen. Kieran noticed how careful her movements were, like she had done this many times before. "What's your name?" he whispered. "Lyra," she replied without looking back. "And you?" "Kieran." She nodded once but kept walking. It was clear she didn't trust him yet, but she also hadn't left him behind. They reached a collapsed courtyard where the ground had been torn apart by blasts. The air was hot, and the smell of burned metal made Kieran cough. Lyra pointed to a low tunnel on the far side. "That leads under the old marketplace," she said. "If we're lucky, we can come out near the outer walls." Kieran hesitated. "And if we're not lucky?" She gave him a quick look. "Then we run faster." Her answer made him grin for a second before the sound of shouting nearby cut through the air. Two enemy soldiers appeared at the edge of the courtyard. Lyra grabbed Kieran's arm and pulled him toward the tunnel. The ground shook again as one of the soldiers fired, the shot hitting the rubble beside them. Kieran stumbled but managed to follow her into the dark passage. Inside, the air was cooler but smelled of damp stone. Their footsteps echoed softly as they moved deeper, the noise of the battle above growing faint. Lyra kept a steady pace, her eyes scanning the shadows ahead. After several minutes, they emerged into a small chamber lit by a single cracked lantern. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. Lyra walked to a corner and opened a wooden crate, pulling out two small water flasks. She handed one to Kieran. "You need to drink," she said. He took it gratefully, the cool water easing his dry throat. "Why are you helping me?" he asked again. This time, she looked directly at him. "Because I've seen what the enemy does to those they capture. Even a thief doesn't deserve that." Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of something softer underneath. For a moment, Kieran forgot about the danger outside. In this dim light, Lyra's eyes seemed almost warm, despite everything she had said earlier. He realized that, for now, his survival depended entirely on her choice to keep him alive. The quiet in the small chamber did not last long. A distant rumble shook the ground again, and faint dust drifted from the ceiling. Lyra set her water flask down and moved to the far wall, running her hand over the rough stone. Kieran watched her with curiosity. "What are you looking for?" She glanced over her shoulder, away deeper into the tunnels. "The enemy is sweeping the upper streets. If they find the entrance we used, they'll trap us." Her fingers pressed against a cracked section, and with a push, a stone block shifted slightly inward. Kieran stood and stepped closer. "How did you know that was there?" She gave a faint smile. "My family helped build these tunnels during the last war. We had food, weapons, and sometimes people here." She pushed the stone further, revealing a narrow opening just big enough for them to squeeze through. Without hesitation, she ducked inside, her silver hair brushing the walls as she moved. Kieran followed, the rough stone scraping his shoulder as he entered the dark passage. Inside, the air was cooler but heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting left and right, until it opened into a wider corridor supported by old wooden beams. The sound of dripping water echoed softly. "Stay close," Lyra whispered. Kieran nodded and kept a hand against the wall, using it to guide himself. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light from cracks above, where faint beams of the burning sky filtered through. Somewhere far above, he could still hear muffled shouting and the dull thud of explosions. They walked for several minutes before Lyra stopped abruptly, raising a hand. Kieran froze. Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths, one narrow and steep, the other wide and sloping gently downward. Lyra's eyes darted between them, her expression tense. "The wide path is faster," she said quietly, "but if they map the tunnels, it will be the first place they check." Kieran thought for a moment. "So we take the narrow one?" She hesitated. "It's dangerous. The supports are weak. If it collapses, we won't make it out." He looked toward the distant flicker of light from the wide tunnel and then back at her. I'd rather risk the narrow path than walk into their hands. She studied him for a moment before nodding. They squeezed into the smaller tunnel, moving slowly to avoid knocking loose the unstable beams. The walls were damp and cold. Every step felt heavier, the air thinner. Kieran's breathing grew louder in his own ears, but Lyra's steady movements kept him calm. "You've done this before," he whispered. She didn't look back. "I've had to hide before. Not always for myself." Her words hung in the air, hinting at something he didn't fully understand. Before he could ask, a faint scraping noise echoed ahead. They froze. Lyra motioned for him to stay quiet, then crept forward. Kieran followed at a distance, his heart beating hard. The sound grew louder, metal on stone, slow and deliberate. They rounded a bend to see a figure crouched by the wall, wearing tattered armor and holding a strange scanning device. It was not one of the insect-like soldiers, but a smaller alien, thin and wiry, with pale skin and dark, deep-set eyes. The stranger looked up sharply at their approach, his hand going to the weapon at his side. Lyra raised a rod weapon, but the stranger lifted a hand quickly. "Wait," he said in a low, raspy voice. "I am not with them." His accent was strange, but his eyes looked desperate. "Prove it," Lyra demanded. The stranger slowly reached into his armor and pulled out a small metal emblem, a symbol of the resistance. Lyra lowered her weapon slightly, but her stand stayed ready. "If you're resistance, why are you here alone?" The stranger's gaze shifted toward Kieran. "Looking for survivors. Some of our people were taken. I tracked them to these tunnels." His voice tightened. "They will not last long." Kieran felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Then we have to move," he said. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "If this is a trap, it's not," the stranger cut in. "But if you stay here debating, it will be too late." Lyra glanced at Kieran, then back at the stranger. Finally, she nodded. "Lead the way. But if you try anything, I'll end you." The stranger gave a thin smile and started down the tunnel. Kieran followed close behind Lyra, feeling the tension like a weight on his shoulders. The narrow passage soon opened into another chamber, larger than the last. Here, the air was warmer, and faint voices echoed from somewhere ahead. Lyra pressed her finger to her lips and crept toward the sound. Through a jagged hole in the wall, they could see a group of prisoners huddled together, humans and aliens alike, guarded by two insect-armored soldiers. Kieran's fists clenched. "We can't leave them," he whispered. Lyra's golden eyes met his. "We won't." Her voice carried a fierce certainty, and in that moment, Kieran believed she could do anything. The prisoners sat with their hands bound, their faces pale under the flickering light of a damaged lantern. Some were humans in worn-out jackets, others were aliens of different kinds, each looking equally exhausted. The two insect-armored soldiers stood near the only exit, their weapons ready. Lyra studied the scene to the hole in the wall, her breathing steady and controlled. Kieran could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she measured every movement of the guards. The stranger they had met earlier leaned closer. "We take the one on the left first. His armor joint is cracked." His voice was low but certain. Lyra nodded. "Kieran, you stay back until I give the signal." Kieran frowned but didn't argue. He knew this was no time for pride. He tightened his grip on a loose metal pipe he had picked up in the tunnel. Lyra's golden eyes locked with his for a moment, as if making sure he understood. Then she turned back toward the hole. They slipped silently into the chamber through a narrow break in the wall's edge. The damaged armor joint made the first guard slower to react, and Lyra struck without hesitation. Her rod slammed into the side of his neck, sending him sprawling before he could even raise his weapon. The second soldier spun toward them, mandibles clicking sharply. The stranger charged forward, slamming his shoulder into the guard's chest and knocking him off balance. Kieran saw the opening and rushed in, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The impact rang out like a struck bell, and the soldier fell heavily to the ground. For a moment, the room was still. Then the prisoners began to stir, some gasping in relief. Lyra moved quickly, cutting the ropes from their wrists with a sharp piece of scrap metal. "Quiet," she warned. "There could be more nearby." One of the humans, an older man with a lined face, nodded and helped free the others. Kieran noticed that even in the chaos, Lyra's movement stayed calm and precise. She had done this before, and she did it well. The stranger pointed toward a dark archway at the far end of the chamber. That leads to the lower escape tunnels. We can get them out that way. Lyra nodded, but kept her weapon raised. Kieran, take the rear. Make sure no one falls behind. Kieran moved to his position, glancing back at the freed prisoners as they began to move. Some limped, others leaned on their neighbors, but they all kept quiet. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the darkness ahead. As they made their way deeper, the air grew colder. The walls narrowed again, forcing them into a tight single line. Kieran kept his eyes on the shadows behind them, his heart beating in rhythm with the steady steps of the group. He could hear faint drips of water somewhere in the distance, but no sign of pursuit yet. Lyra stayed near the front, guiding the group with quick hand signals whenever the tunnel forked. The stranger stayed close to her, scanning the way ahead for danger. After several minutes, they reached a wider section of tunnel where the ceiling arched high above. Here, the air felt fresher and a faint breeze stirred the dust. Almost there, Lyra whispered. The older human man from before caught up to her. We owe you our lives. Lyra shook her head. You can repay me by making out alive. Her voice was firm, but Kieran could see the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her lips. The moment of relief did not last. A loud metallic clang echoed from behind them, followed by the sharp clicking of armored feet. Kieran's grip tightened on the pipe. They found us. Lyra turned to the stranger. Get them out. Kieran and I will hold them off. The stranger's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, her tone leaving no room for argument. The prisoners hurried into the next section, disappearing around the bend. Lyra stepped up beside Kieran, her weapon ready. Stay close, she said. We fight together. For the first time since they met, Kieran realized she was trusting him with her life. The first of the insect-armored soldiers burst into the wide section of the tunnel, its mandibles snapping and its weapon raised. Lyra moved first, stepping into its path and striking hard at the gap between its shoulder plates. The impact made the soldier stumble, but another came charging from behind it. Kieran swung his pipe low, striking the second one's leg joint and forcing it to drop to one knee. The sound of their metallic limbs scraping against the stone filled the air. The enemy regrouped quickly. One swung its clawed arm toward Lyra, but she ducked under it and drove her weapon upward into the exposed section of its torso. Sparks flew as the soldier collapsed. Kieran found himself face to face with the one he had struck earlier. It lunged, and he barely managed to twist aside, the claws scraping his shoulder. Pain flared, but he held his ground. With a sharp breath, he swung again, this time aiming for its head. The blow landed with a hollow crack, and the soldier fell still. Lyra glanced back toward the bend where the prisoners had gone. We can't stay here. More will come. Her voice was steady but urgent. Kieran nodded, his breathing heavy. They began moving quickly down the tunnel, keeping their weapons ready. The sounds of the battle behind them faded, replaced by the echo of their footsteps and the distant hum of air vents deeper in the underground network. As they pushed forward, the tunnel began to slope upward. The air grew warmer, and faint light appeared ahead. Lyra slowed her pace, listening carefully. We're close to the outer tunnels, she said. If we can make it past the last checkpoint, they won't follow. Kieran frowned. And if there's a patrol waiting? She met his eyes. Then we make sure they don't report back. There was no hesitation in her tone, and Kieran felt a surge of determination to match hers. When they reached the source of the light, they found a tall gate made of reinforced metal bars blocking their path. 2 insect-armored soldiers stood guard, their backs to them. Lyra signaled for silence and studied the scene. We need them away from the gate, she whispered. Kieran looked around, spotting a loose stone near the wall. He picked it up and threw it down a side passage. The sharp clatter echoed loudly, and both guards turned toward the sound. Lyra moved like a flash, covering the distance in seconds and striking the first soldier in the neck. Kieran followed, slamming his pipe into the other's weapon arm before it could fire. The fight was quick but brutal. Within moments, the 2 guards lay motionless on the tunnel floor. Lyra found a control panel near the gate and began pressing the unfamiliar symbols. With a deep mechanical groan, The gate slowly slid open. "Hurry," she said, waving Kieran through. The air beyond was fresher, carrying the scent of wind from outside. They stepped into a wide cavern, the faint glow of the surface visible through cracks in the rock above. The freed prisoners were waiting near the far wall, guarded by the stranger they had met earlier. Relief spread across their faces when they saw Lyra and Kieran. "We thought you were lost," the older man said. Lyra shook her head. "Not yet." She glanced toward the exit. "We move now, before the next patrol comes." The group began climbing toward the light, their footsteps quick but careful on the uneven stone. Kieran stayed near the rear, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. As they reached the last rise before the surface, a faint rumble echoed through the ground. Lyra froze, her eyes narrowing. "That's not patrol movement," she murmured. A second later, a blast shook the cavern, sending dust and small stones raining down. The stranger shouted for everyone to move faster. Kieran grabbed the arm of a limping prisoner and helped him forward. The light ahead grew brighter, and the air turned cooler as they neared the exit. When they finally stepped out onto the rocky slope above the tunnels, the open sky stretched before them. The fires of the colony were still visible in the distance, but the air felt free. Lyra turned to Kieran, her gaze steady. "We're not safe yet, but we have a chance." Her words carried weight, but also a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. The wind on the rocky slope carried the smell of smoke and dust from the burning colony behind them. The prisoners moved in a tight group, guided by Lyra and the stranger. Kieran stayed at the rear, scanning the jagged terrain for signs of pursuit. His arm ached from the fight, but he pushed the pain aside. Every step forward was another step away from the enemy's grasp. They followed a narrow path along the ridge, the ground uneven and sharp under their boots. Lyra kept glancing at the horizon, where the faint outline of a transport beacon glowed in the distance. "That's our way out," she said quietly. "If it's still working, we can call for a pickup." Kieran quickened his pace until he was beside her. "And if it's not?" She met his eyes with a small, fierce smile. "Then we make it work." There was no doubt in her voice, and it gave him strength. The climb grew harder as they neared the top of the ridge. Loose stones slid underfoot, threatening to pull them back down. Kieran offered his hand to one of the smaller prisoners, helping them up the steepest section. The stranger moved ahead to check the beacon, disappearing over the crest. Lyra's golden eyes stayed sharp, scanning every shadow. "Keep moving," she urged, her tone carrying both command and encouragement. When they reached the top, Kieran saw the beacon, a tall metal tower, scarred by fire but still standing. The stranger was already at the controls, pressing buttons and adjusting dials. A faint hum filled the air, followed by a pulsing blue light that cut through the haze. "It's working," he called. Lyra's shoulders eased slightly, but she did not lower her weapon. "Good. Now we wait, but not here in the open." She guided the group to a rocky overhang nearby, giving them some cover from the sky. Minutes passed, and the sound of the wind was broken by a distant hum. Kieran looked up to see a dark shape cutting through the clouds. It grew larger, the outline of a small transport craft becoming clear. Relief flickered in his chest, but it was short-lived. From behind the ridge, the clicking of armored feet rose again. Lyra's expression hardened. "They found us." She stepped forward, weapon ready. Kieran moved to her side without hesitation. The first soldier crested the ridge, followed by two more. Lyra struck fast, her rod cracking against the lead soldier's chest. Kieran swung his pipe at the second, knocking it off balance. The stranger fired a small pulse pistol he had hidden until now, dropping the third. The fight was quick and brutal, leaving the soldiers sprawled in the dirt. The transport hovered overhead, lowering a platform toward them. "Go!" Lyra shouted to the prisoners. "Get on now." They moved quickly, climbing aboard with the stranger helping them up. Kieran was the last to step onto the platform, but he turned back when he saw Lyra still standing on the ridge. "Come on," he called. She looked at him for a long moment, her golden eyes steady. "You could have run back in the tunnels, but you didn't. You fought beside me. That means something." He frowned, not sure what she meant. She stepped onto the platform, standing close enough for him to see the faint smile on her lips. "I think I was wrong about you, Kieran. You're no thief. You're someone worth trusting." Her words sank deep, heavier than the wind or the battle behind them. The transport lifted into the air, the burning colony growing smaller below. Kieran stood beside Lyra, the cold wind rushing past. She didn't look away from the horizon, but her hand brushed against his for just a moment. It was a small gesture, but it told him more than words could. Somewhere in that ruined colony, their paths had been tied together, and neither of them would forget it.